Hi everybody and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles, and on this episode we're going to talk about the anti-diva Daffney. Now you may have heard that term referencing other wrestlers or other women in wrestling, but to me Daffney was the first person to encompass that and really be that in professional wrestling, and she's kind of someone that I think doesn't quite get the recognition she deserves. So we're going to talk about her here. First, as you may or may not know, Daffney, her real name is Shannon Spurl, and I'm probably pronouncing her last name wrong. She started off as basically David Flair's girlfriend in WCW in 1999, where she had kind of a gothic, alternative girl look to her, very different than anything else that was going on before that in wrestling. I mean, we're talking about the era of the Sunnies, the Sables, Marlenas, even more of the serious wrestlers like Medusa had a certain quote-unquote sex appeal and girl next door look to it. Here we have Daffney coming onto the scene and basically bringing you a total different side of that. Something like someone you might see if you went to a Marilyn Manson concert or hanging out at the mall and going to Hot Topic. She came in and she immediately made an impact. She became what they called the Scream Queen. Basically, during his matches, David Flair's that is, she would scream at the top of her lungs like a banshee. It was kind of her thing, kind of her way to distract people. Eventually they added Crowbar to the group, which I thought was an amazing grouping. A lot of bad stuff is talked about the last couple of years of WCW. And don't get me wrong, there's plenty to criticize there, but there's some of it there that I think is really great. And this is one of those situations that I think is really great and really changed perception a bit in the pro wrestling world. Fast forward a little bit to May 15th, 2000. We have a match, and yes, this is right in the middle of the Russo and Bischoff era. We have a match. It's Daffney and Crowbar going up against Tammy Lynn Sitch and Chris Candido. Chris Candido at the time was the Cruiserweight champion. His championship was on the line in this match, which is why I had to mention it is the Russo era. Daffney picks up the win by pinning Tammy Sitch, thus making Crowbar and Daffney the co-champions. Again, not her fault for a little bit of the weird booking. The next week, her and Crowbar wrestle each other to see who's going to be the solo Cruiserweight champion. She picks up the win here. In a very much a surprise, she becomes only the second female to become the Cruiserweight champion, Medusa doing it first. And while that may not seem that crazy nowadays, when we've seen Chyna win Intercontinental Championships, we've seen Tessa Blanchard win the Impact Heavyweight Championship, we've seen intergender wrestling be a thing both on a national and independent level, this was relatively new at the time. She would go on to hold that belt for a little while, and then she would lose it in a three-way match against Lieutenant Loco, which is Chavo Guerrero, and Disco Inferno, losing it to Lieutenant Loco. Part of the reason she lost this is because David Flair's new girlfriend came to distract her, and that was Miss Hancock, aka Stacy Keibler. This led to probably her biggest feud as a wrestler in WCW, her and Miss Hancock, which led to probably her most famous WCW match, which would be at Bash of the Beach 2000 in the wedding gown match, her versus Miss Hancock, which again, we are in the Russo era, so there is a little bit of silliness here. The thing of it is, all through this time, she's building a following, and she's building up a reputation as one of the most interesting characters in WCW. Well, as we know, WCW doesn't last much longer from that time, and just before they do go out of business, they let her go. Now, fast forward a little bit, 2002, we have the formation of TNA Wrestling, where she does some appearances at TNA as both herself and as Shark Girl, aka Shark Boy's valet. She'd make some sporadic appearances there between 02 and 03. Then in April 2003, one of my favorite little runs of hers, it was just a short run for a few months, but she shows up in Ring of Honor as Lucy, and she's the girlfriend of CM Punk. Immediately she's put into the Second City Saints storylines, and one of the great promos of all time, the CM Punk This Is Straight Edge promo, you could see her standing there. She doesn't say anything during the promo. She's standing there next to the Second City Saints. Part of that was she, at the time, was actually dating CM Punk in real life. That didn't work out for other reasons, which we're not going to get into much here. We're basically going to talk about her career. And then in July of the same year, 2003, she gets a WWE developmental contract. Well, that didn't last too long. From July to December, she basically stayed in the WWE's developmental system. In December 2003, she gets released, and then she decides to retire for a time. She stays retired for about a year and a half, and in 2005, she decides to make a comeback, starts making a lot of indie appearances, and basically building up her popularity, her fame again. Fast forward to 2007, she gets involved with Shimmer, which is one of the preeminent women's wrestling organizations in the world at the time, and still is to this day, where she goes there to be a manager. She also does some wrestling as both herself and as Shark Girl. From those appearances, she would go back to TNA Wrestling from 2008 to 2009, and well, she would go there for longer than that, but from 08 to 09, she would be one of her more popular gimmicks, where she came in as the Governor. And basically, if you haven't seen it, the Governor was her take on Governor Sarah Palin, who was at the time running to be Vice President of the United States. And it was uncanny how similar they looked. That kind of ran its course. She had a feud with the beautiful people who cut her hair, which brought her back into her Daffney gimmick, which she would go on to be part of the Dr. Stevie stuff, which I thought was really good. It is a little bit hokey, and a lot of people either love or hate it, but the Dr. Stevie, Raven, Daffney stuff, I always enjoyed. I'm a big fan of Stevie Richards, big fan of Raven, and as you could tell by me making this video, a big fan of Daffney as well. So the three of them together really piqued my interest. She did that for about a year or so, picked up some injuries while she was there, which we'll get into in a bit later, talking about that. Afterwards, from about 2011 to 2018, she would go on to Shine, another preeminent women's wrestling organization, where she served as both the hostess for Shine shows and the manager. And during this time, Shine was a really good show. Shine and Shimmer both were, and they kind of fed off of each other. They used a lot of the same talents, they used a lot of the same kind of style to their matches, and they were both very good. You could kind of see where women's wrestling is now and trace it back to those shows and see just how much it pushed forward women in wrestling. I mean, people like Mia Yim would wrestle there, Saraya, aka Paige, would wrestle there, Becky Lynch. A lot of the prominent female wrestlers of the day got their start at this time in those organizations. After about 2018, she retired from full-time wrestling and would only make some sporadic appearances, which leads us, and we're going to talk about something again at the end here, to her legacy. I mentioned it in the very beginning when I talked about how she came in and basically changed what the image of a women's wrestler should be or could be, and introduced a new, different look to that, something not your quintessential blonde Barbie doll look or overly inflated, surgically enhanced women's wrestlers. She was a character, and she was a character that spoke to a certain kind of people that felt a kinship to a gothic character or a rocker girl or a punk rock girl. You could see that even now when you have Saraya that I mentioned previously, kind of had a similar vein. Also Ruby Riott, who has a very different look than most of the wrestling females, and it's more open now that women in wrestling aren't necessarily just judged on the size of their cups or how many posters they sell. They're judged on their talent, which is amazing. It's great that it's gone now. And I think Daffney is one of the people that kind of pushed it into that realm without much getting credit for it, which is kind of why I wanted to honor her here, because I feel like we need to talk about Daffney and we need to keep bringing her up and keep her memory alive. Which brings us to the last thing I want to talk about. In 2021, as you may or may not know, I'm guessing most of the people that are clicking on this know of this already, Daffney committed suicide. And a lot of it's been attested to maybe some in-ring injuries, some trauma she had, some concussion she had. We've seen some of that tied there. And I definitely understand if you're a person that is triggered by talks of this, if you'd like to go ahead and and leave right now and stop the video, I implore you to do so. But I just want to talk about this for a minute. First off, if you're in need of help, there's a number you could call. If you don't feel like you have any friends, if you don't feel like you have any family, if you feel like nobody gives a crap about you, all you have to do in the United States, I don't know if there's international numbers, I hope there are, is dial the number 988, and that is a suicide prevention hotline. And the reason I wanted to bring this up at the end, and I wanted to include this, is for my personal story. And by saying that, I haven't had any attempts at suicide myself. I haven't had any serious threats of myself, harming myself in that way. But I will tell you, 8 years ago, 2015, I got a call from one of my best friends, my friend April, and we were talking about her cousin Lonnie, who was also a really good friend of, beautiful human being, one of the sweetest, most genuine humans you would have ever met. Always in good spirits, always smiling, always laughing, just a stand-up guy. Every time I seen him, he would greet me with a great big hug. He would make fun of me. I would make fun of him. We'd laugh. We'd joke. Fantastic human being. Well, Lonnie was going through some issues, going through a divorce at the time, and it was a little bit rough on him. Unfortunately, Lonnie decided that he was going to end his life. And I think about this so often, how I wish he would have just called me and said, hey man, let's go have a drink. Let's just hang out. Let's play video games like we used to. Let's do anything. And the reason I'm saying this is it wasn't obvious. He wasn't someone you would ever thought would do that. The warning signs weren't out there in the open. Yeah, he was going through stuff, but a lot of people have. I have several friends that have went through divorce at this point. I'm in my mid-40s. I myself have been through a lot of stuff myself. To this day, that call and knowing about that shakes me and it rattles me, because here was a guy that I absolutely loved. There's no question about it. I loved that man. He was a great friend. He was a great person. He was like family to me, and he committed suicide, and that really made it real to me. You know, you hear stuff like Robin Williams committed suicide or Chester Bennington, and yeah, it might be depressing and it might be sad, and you might have loved Patch Adams or Linkin Park, but do you really know that person? Well, I really knew Lon, and I wish he would have reached out. And the reason I'm bringing this story up, and the reason I'm talking about it here, and the reason that that picture of that phone number has been up this entire story, is if you're someone that is going through that, and you feel that there's no other there's option. Lonnie has grandchildren he hasn't seen that would have loved him. He would have been a great grandfather. Lonnie has family members that to this day miss and think about him every day. I think about him quite often. Again, fantastic human being, and I just wish he would have reached out to one of us or reached out to somebody before making that decision. And I implore you, if you're watching this and you get into that area and you think that way, that you reach out to someone. And if you don't have anybody, please reach out to that number. It's not a topic that's fun to talk about. It's not a topic that we like to hear about often, but it's an important topic. And it's one that I think most people are going to get affected by in one way or another at some point in their life. So for that, I did want to talk about that part of the story, and I did want to include my personal experience. With all that being said, my name is George Coles, and this has been my tribute to Daffney.